Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Women Serve 2. Today we have Sam Sliney with us. She is a mom of three and a wife to an Army Green Beret. So we're definitely going to be talking about the mill to mill marriage, especially across branches. She's a dedicated member of the U.S. Air Force as judge advocate since 2014 with extensive experience on active duty as well as the Air National Guard. As a federal civilian employee, she works at the Joint Special Operations Command as an attorney advisor. So she's definitely a wealth of knowledge here. She is committed to shaping a Department of Defense that provides essential support and resources for the success of all service members. She leads and has led multiple initiatives aimed at developing policies, advancing medical research, improving access to healthcare for women at every stage in life, and challenging culture norms surrounding parenthood and career. So, Sam, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
I am too. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to ask everyone, like, what is your journey in the military? Like, what inspired you to join? I mean, you being a judge advocate, that's like a little bit different approach because I think you have to be a lawyer before you come in. So tell us a little bit about your military experience.
Absolutely. So there's a couple different ways to become a judge advocate or JAG or military lawyer, whatever you want to call it. For me, I am not from a military family at all, but my now husband, then boyfriend, was going through basic training in the Army. And we started dating. Fast forward a couple years. He's doing all these really cool things in the Army, right, as a Green Beret. Jumping out of airplanes, going on all these cool trips, awesome places across the world, also doing some not so fun things. But I was like, graduated undergrad and then decided that I wanted to go to law school. And really, that was not the plan. I had always wanted to be a journalist. And for those that know me well, know that I like to write. I do a lot of op ed publishing in various forums on various topics. But I learned very quickly that if I was going to be married to him and live at what was then Fort Bragg, which is now Fort Liberty, there's not really a market for journalists in North Carolina. So I took some law classes and fell in love with the law, ended up going straight to law school. And in law school, after you do an internship after your every spring semester. So my first semester, I interned at Pope Air Force Base Legal Office, which is now Pope Army Airfield. And it's co-located with Fort Liberty, and was like, hey, they're going to give me a stipend to do this. I can live at home. It's not going to cost me anything. And this military thing seems pretty cool. So why not do it? So I was a legal intern that summer and absolutely fell in love with all the work. I pretty much shadowed Air Force paralegals and JAGs that entire summer learning what they did. Now, law school is 3 years, so fast forward, I did other internships, but really just kept coming back to JAG. But it's a very competitive selection process. So I didn't really have my hopes up too much, but I did apply in my fall semester of my last year of law school and ended up getting selected to come on to active duty via what they call direct appointment. There's many ways to come on active duty as a JAG. You can do like I did, which is where you just apply like you're applying for a job. There's some ROTC programs as well. On if you're on active duty and you're in a different career field, you can apply via the FLEP program, the Funded Legal Education Program. They also now have that available for enlisted, where you can have your bachelor's and then the Air Force will send you to law school, which is super cool. So, yeah, there's a lot of really cool ways. I just happened to come through one of those. And mainly it was because I was very young when I graduated law school. I was only 25. And so I didn't want to be stuck doing one area of the law all the time. I found that kind of boring. And couple that with seeing what my then boyfriend was doing and all the cool things he was doing. And then also with the fact that I was like, I'm going to get paid to work out. Like, you can't beat that. So here I am, 10 years on active duty as an active duty JAG, a little over 10 years. And then now I'm in the New Jersey Air National Guard as a JAG. So the plan was originally just to do 4 years, and it was to me to get experience so that I could get a job as a federal civilian on base. Everybody had told me that in order to get one of those jobs, you need to have JAG experience. So we're like, okay, we're going to be dual mill. We're probably not going to be stationed together. We'll just suck it up for 4 years, and then you can get experience and move on. And like I said, that not really what happened. I ended up loving it and staying. So ultimately, the dual meal lifestyle ended up catching up with us, where it wasn't really compatible for both of us to be on active duty, and we can chat more about that. But that's my story.
Yeah, I was wondering if you loved it so much, like you did 10 years, like is what caused, because I'm assuming it had to be because he's Army or Air Force, and it's at some point it's going to be hard to be co-located. Is that what happened, or talk us a little bit through that?
Sure. So our first duty assignment was not together. I was at Seymour Johnson, and he was at Fort Liberty, about an hour and a half away. But we didn't have children or anything, so I lived there during the week and would come home on the weekends. I was able to get back to Pope when Pope was downsized because it's no longer an Air Force base; it's an Army airfield. There is not a very large Air Force presence there anymore. In fact, I think there's only like 6 Air Force JAG billets. And at the time, I didn't know that like I didn't understand the idea of like an Air Force billet or an Army billet, and like that mattered. I just thought that you were in the military, and if there was a job, you went there. So the JAG Corps was able to get me to Pope. We are the only AFSC in the Air Force where our assignments are controlled exclusively by the Judge Advocate General, our 3-star. They're not controlled by AFPC or the AFPC commander. So it's a little different. But they were able to get me back here, and I had 3 of those 6 jobs when I was at Pope. And my last one was in a special operations unit, an Air Force special operations unit here as their JAG. And I was kind of embedded down at the group level, which was fantastic. But we just got to a point where JAGs, we move every 2 years. So we're on a 2-year assignment cycle. It's very rapid. I was able to do 3 years in some jobs, most likely because I was dual mill and they were trying to make that work. But we were coming up on a situation where there was likely only one other job at Pope that I would qualify for, which could potentially get me to 13 years. But after that, there were just no more jobs here. Like there was not going to be another opportunity. So I was lucky enough to have a civilian attorney opportunity come up when I was on parental leave with my third. I was encouraged to apply for a job, which is the job I have now. So it was a little bit timing. It was an emotional roller coaster because I definitely wasn't ready to leave active duty. I loved serving. I loved wearing the uniform every day. But with kind of just kicking the can down the road, eventually we were either going to be separated or my husband, who's got 19 years in, could retire. But honestly, I had no desire and still have no desire to, drag my family and my kids around the world every 2 years. It just wasn't something that I'm interested in choosing for my family. So it was a lot of different factors, but the dual meal situation had a lot to do with it.
Because I was going to say, like, how often does the Army move around? Like, was he able to move around, or like, could you guys go both together to a different area?
So he works in a command here. He's been at Fort Liberty since 2008. So he's in a command, very high ops tempo. When he's on an operational team, he's gone 6+ months out of the year, like not necessarily in one chunk, but like broken up and cumulative. When you add it up, it's quite a bit of time. So very high ops tempo, but they allow them to homestead here at Fort Liberty. So we're really blessed in that, all 3 of my children have come home from the hospital to the same home. And this is the only place that they've ever known. So their experience as military children is very unique because they haven't moved. And honestly, that ability to homestead probably made it, much more harder for me to kind of embrace the moving, every 2 years. Right. I hear all these horror stories about PCSing and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to ever have to deal with that.
I will say I hate PCSing. Yes.
Like just reestablishing childcare, whatever childcare you use, whether it be daycare, a nanny, the CDC, like getting your stuff from point A to point B. Like I hear all these horror stories, like who would have known, like, containers fall off the side of ships in the ocean and people lose all their stuff.
I actually have a friend whose stuff that happened to.
It's crazy.
It does happen. Like more frequently than a lot of people think.
Yeah, it's just all of that combined with like the kind of, I would call it the expedited PCS cycle for JAGs, just wasn't something I was interested in. as I look to like what's good for me and my family.
So you said that your husband had like high tempos and is like constantly like kind of out of pocket, if you will. So how was that with kids? Like being two separate branches and then having three kids? Because your kids are young.
Yep,
So
there's
how was that?
I call it controlled chaos.
Yeah.
Controlled chaos is what I call it. I don't know how controlled it is, but that's what I tell myself. It is tricky. So we've always used, childcare for us has always been a nanny. It is more expensive, but we didn't really have an option not to do that because we couldn't use the traditional hours of the CDC, right? Where I got to pick them up at 5:30. He may not be able to get off to work. He may not even be here to get off of work to go get them. And then, if I'm working a court martial or in court or something like that, I can't just, raise my hand and be like, we need to break for the day because I got to go pick my kids up. Unfortunately, that's just not where we're at. And I recognize that that's just part of being in the military. So having a nanny that is like a part of our family has been an absolute godsend for us because we've had that kind of flexibility. When the Department of Defense rolled out its subsidy program for nannies, we were able to take advantage of that. So we're in one of the pilot locations where our family is kind of testing that out, which has been great. One of the good things about homesteading is we have other support here. So not our blood family, but our chosen family, our military family. So if we can't deconflict schedules and we both have to be TDY or gone somewhere, we have people that we can say, hey, can you come do an overnight with the kids? Or can the kids stay at your house for the night and hang out? We're also lucky that our families only live about 8 hours away. So in a pinch, we can have them come up or fly them up or have them drive up to come spend time with the kids. But it's a lot of logistics. As a matter of fact, before we hopped on here, we were talking like vacation planning for next year. My husband was on the phone with his mom and she's like, I don't understand why we're talking about things for next July. And he's like, we have to get this figured out. So it's things like that. It's the logistics are just next level.
And like I could only imagine my husband's still currently in, and sometimes you don't get the dates, right? Like, a deployment is coming up or a TDY is coming up, and it's like, okay, when? Oh, we don't know yet. Maybe around October. Okay. Like it's such a broad thing. And especially when you have kids and, you're trying to work your own schedule and then the kids' schedule and then the unknown of the military. It is hard because you're right. Like the traditional CDC, yeah, it's great. But if you're doing 24/7 ops, or something comes up, it's not very feasible. And I don't think like we've really addressed the childcare issues that the military could potentially help with. And especially like dual mill too, right? Like say one of you deployed or both you deployed or one deployed and then you're working mids or swings. Like then what? Because what if you're not by family? Like there's so many things that people don't think about when you are in like a mill to mill situation.
I was just going to add, like, I think the group of folks that are in those situations that are left behind the most are single parents. I remember at my first duty assignment, because as a JAG, right, we see a lot of stuff. We see a lot of great things. We also see a lot of not great things. And I didn't realize I didn't have children. I didn't realize they didn't have 24/7 care. Like the flight line at Seymour Johnson is 24/7. Like I knew that. Our maintainers work shifts. It's always manned. There's always stuff going on. It didn't become apparent to me until we had a case that came through the office of allegations of child neglect. And it was a woman maintainer, single parent, who had been put on nights. She had 2 young children. One was like 9. I think the other one was like 7. They were just under the threshold to be able to stay on base at home by themselves. So what came out, like how this happened, was a neighbor called like the local MPs and basically were like, hey, it's at night and the kids are home by themselves. And as like they dug back the onion, what she would do, because she didn't have any childcare options, is and they wouldn't take her off night shifts. She would essentially come home from work in the morning, wake them up, get them off to school, sleep, during the day while they're at school, pick them up from school, bring them home, make sure their homework and everything was done until she had to go on shift. She would leave a cell phone with them in the event of emergency, but she would get them ready for bed, and then they would go to sleep, and they were on base, so she would go home on her break to check on them. But she couldn't
Mm.
afford to pay anybody to stay overnight with them. And so someone called the cops on her for child neglect. When in reality, she was just doing the best that she could with the cards that she had been dealt. I mean, it was a really significant thing, and it came out that like she had asked, her leadership for some more support to take her off nights, and unfortunately, she didn't have leadership that was willing to do that. It was kind of like, we didn't issue children, that's not our problem. But that was the first time that I was like, wow, this system, this is broken. Like, this is not okay. We're asking folks to work, but we're not providing them the resources they need to actually do their job.
And that's actually one of the main things or main reasons why especially single women get out, is because if their leadership's not taking care of them and they don't have any other options, their only option is to get out. And then it is something that needs to be addressed. Like, was from that case, did anything come out of it where there was like changes in policy, or is it still something that we just need to keep talking about?
It's still something we need to keep talking about. So, like my work I do with the Women's Initiative team, we have a childcare line of effort, and they still don't have 24/7 ops. Like, it's a huge problem for the Space Force because they work 20. That is like their normal battle rhythm is 24/7 ops. We have some Air Force bases where that is the case, where we have capabilities where we're actually doing like the mission, but from back home, right? It's still not a problem that's been solved. I mean, gosh, and that was over 10 years ago where I saw it. And I know the dialogue, the WIT is still engaging in that dialogue, but it's nothing. I haven't seen any tangible change, to answer your question.
So you mentioned WIT, the Women's Initiative team. For those who don't know what WIT is, can you explain to the people who are listening?
Sure. So the Department of the Air Force Women's Initiative team is a barrier analysis working group. So it's an official Department of the Air Force, we call it DAF, that's the short name for acronym, group of women doing barrier analysis. And essentially what we do is we work to identify and eliminate barriers that impact women's service across the department. When we say women, it's not just uniform wearing women, it's federal civilian women, and then all components, reserve, guard, and active duty service women. These barriers usually are apparent in policy. So for the Air Force side of things, right, a lot of our policies are very old. They've been around a really long time. And it is common knowledge, right, that when the Air Force was created and even the other services were created, right, it was a man's world. For the longest time, women were not allowed to officially serve. And unfortunately, we still have policies that are indicative of kind of that heritage, right? That it is set up, military service is set up for a man that is serving and a wife that is staying home taking care of the children. So we look for those barriers and policies. We also look now, so now that we've been making, some change, policy gaps. So where should we have a policy that we don't have a policy? For example, lactation support, right? That was something where we had a gap. Like, it was almost like, oh, no one thought that women would need to lactate and have babies, right? Same thing with con leave following birth, right? Like, at one point, that was not a thing. Like, no one thought like, oh, the woman just went through birth, she's going to need time to medically recover. So we had to have that evolution until we got to that point. So that's how we do it. We do it through barrier analysis. And the key to that really is that's a fancy word for is we collect and analyze data, and then we see if that data validates whatever barrier we think we have found. So for example, with lactation, we were able to collect data that showed how many women are pregnant in the Air and the Space Forces on a given year. We were able to take that and compare it to CDC rates of breastfeeding to determine approximately how many servicewomen we might have breastfeeding at any given time. So that's an example of kind of how we use that data to say, yep, actually, we need this policy because we actually have X number of women who are actually going through this right now.
So you mentioned Air Force and Space Force. Do the other branches have something similar to this too? Or is the Air Force / Space Force kind of navigating the policies for all of the services?
It started originally, the Air Force was the first to have it. In 2008 is when it was established. That was prior to the Space Force. So we were the first. just this last year. So the Army, and kind of at the advisement of the DAFWIT, we kind of helped them do this. The Army was the second to stand up an official women's initiative team. I believe theirs rolled out in 2022. And then the Navy was actually able to roll theirs out probably just almost a year ago now. So those much newer. They're structured a little bit differently than the DAFWIT. The only service who does not have an official women's initiative team is the Marine Corps.
Why do you think that is? Maybe because there's not as many?
No, I mean, if anything, they probably need it the most. Now, what in the meetings I have been in, what they have said is that they are doing barrier analysis and they are addressing barriers, but they're not calling it a women's initiatives team. Now, I don't know why that is, if it's a cultural thing for the Marine Corps, because they do have a very, very rich heritage and rich culture. But I will say, I have seen, and we are seeing some really great things come out of the Marine Corps. So at the end of the day, I don't really care what they call it. Like, call it whatever you want. The important part is we are looking at these barriers. We're doing that data analytics, and we are getting after these barriers, because the ultimate goal, right, and what a lot of people talk about, right, is why can't we keep women in the service so that they can reach the senior ranks? Like, why do we have so few general and flag officers that are women, and what's preventing women from being able to kind of fleet up through the ranks? And on multiple RAND studies done internal to the department, a lot of these barriers are what women point out, similar to you point out, like why single women choose to get out, right, for the lack of childcare resources. Well, if you don't provide me the resources I need, it doesn't matter how good of an airman I am, or how good of a soldier I am. If I don't have anybody to watch my kids while I'm working or while I'm deployed, I can't serve. Now, and we don't try to say, like, you know, it's still military service, right? We all have to go and do things that we don't want to do. That's part of being in the military. But there are things that we could do a lot better to help varying demographics be able to serve. And it's not limited to women or even minorities, right? Like, look at the example of parental leave. Up until 2 years ago, men didn't, like, I think they got like 14 days of 21 days, depending on what service you were in. 21 days
short
of parental leave. And, you know, everybody, the cultural barrier there was, everybody's like, oh, well, you're the man, you don't need to do anything. But what are the second and third order impacts of that? Well, you're furthering the stereotype that childcare is a woman's problem, right? You're also ignoring the fact that, like, what a man can do to help a woman recover from birth, because it is a, you know, and especially for those who have C-sections, it could be a major surgery. And also you're just negating the fact that, like, a child should have two parents, or generally has two parents. And if a parent wants to be involved in their child's life, there are plenty of sociology studies that show that that is what is beneficial for the child. So why are we treating men like second class citizens and saying that they don't have a right to be a parent? And that was internal to the Department of Air Force. That was worked by the Women's Initiative team. Like, we worked parental leave parity because we saw the impact it was having on women leaving. Like, hey, if I'm dual mill and you're not going to give my spouse time off, you know, I just had a major surgery and now you're expecting me to be able to, like, you know, I always joke with C-sections. I've thankfully never had one, but, like, lots of friends that have said, like, it is the only major surgery where we expect a woman to be able to get up within 24 hours and care for another human being. Like, it's absolutely mind-boggling to me.
All of my kids were C-section, and, you know, and when I didn't have kids, I was naive. I was like, 6 weeks is plenty, right? Like, and I think part of it too is until you go through that experience, you're not going to appreciate it. So, and that's why I do appreciate what the Women's Initiative team is doing for both men and women as far as, like, the parental leave, because, like, I had C-sections and there is no freaking way 6 weeks later I would be mentally and physically capable of even putting back a uniform on. And, like, anyone who has newborns know, like, the first 30 days, like, they're waking up every 2 hours. Some women decide not to breastfeed. So, which I didn't. So I made sure my husband did some of the feeding. So, like, yes, like 10 days is nothing.
Yeah.
And you do put a lot of that onto the woman at that point, because then the men could say, well, I got work, you're going to have to deal with the baby all night.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, in your case, like where you have multiples, like, oh my goodness, like I don't even know how, like and hopefully, right, you and babies are all healthy. Like what happens,
Mhm.
this is another gap that we have that we're working, right, is parents who have children who are in the NICU. Like
Mm,
right now, there's no type
yeah.
of leave that's authorized for parents who have children in the NICU. So right now, what some people have to do is they have to burn their parental leave. Well, am I really bonding with my child if they're in an incubator and I can't even hold them? Right? Or for a woman, like you may be on con leave, but you're medically recovering. You're not actually getting to like hold and bond and do all those things that you would normally do. And it's a big gap right now for those families that have to go through, you know, short to lengthy NICU stays, depending on what the medical complexities are for the situation.
And another thing is like location. So right now we're stationed at Eltis Air
Oh
Force Base
goodness.
in the,
Yeah.
yeah, middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. Like I had to deliver an hour away because they had a little bit more support as far as twins. So because I had my
Hmm.
twins here, but the University of Oklahoma is 2 hours away from here. And if like the NICU or if the twins did need something a little bit more medical, like they would have to go to Oklahoma City, and that's a 2 hour drive. And then the question becomes, then what? Like if we
Hmm.
were both at this point, like mill to mill.
Hmm.
So that is
Yeah.
definitely a gap, especially with like NICU.
Yeah. Well, and just, the access to medical care in very isolated areas like Altus, just generally speaking, is a big problem, right? Like I'm at Fort Liberty, we have Womack Army Medical Center, which is a great facility in a lot of respects. I gave birth to all three of my kids there. But also, as an active duty servicewoman, I had no choice in where I got to go get care, right? I was told, you will go to Womack. We don't care if you don't like the OBs. I got lucky and I had good experiences. So that's not everybody's lived experience. But then you're also the converse of that, your situation. We're in the middle of nowhere. There is no medical support. I got to drive an hour or 2 hours to get what I need. I think that's a larger issue in American society right now with regards to access to medical care, specifically for women's access to health care. I didn't know until I had my third kid that like pelvic floor physical therapy was something you should do even
Mm-hmm.
when you're pregnant and then also after you give birth. Like I thought you only did it if you were having problems. And even then I was like, well, what's really a problem and what's normal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um
Yeah.
and no one told me. I lucked into that because I had a friend that I worked with at the unit I was assigned to who was an athletic trainer who was like, it is the gold standard. Every woman should get pelvic floor physical therapy after giving birth.
Yes. Like I'm currently going to school for physical therapy, and I am like, why is this not a thing? Because like I was always like, as like a fitness coach and like specifically targeting women, I was like, I always would tell people who are pregnant, I'm like, you need to start doing like deep core breathing and
Mm-hmm.
working your pelvic floor. I was like, because people would be saying, oh, I'm peeing when I exercise or I jump. I was like, that's not normal.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's common, but because it's so common, we normalized it and it is not normal. And yes,
Mm-hmm.
like that is something that I will probably push harder for, especially with like legislation, because every woman, regardless if they had vaginal or C-section, should go through some type of pelvic floor physical
Mm-hmm.
therapy.
Yeah, specifically service women. If you're expecting, I mean, it's much better than what it used to be, where I think most of services give you a year now. But I mean, the things we used to ask service women to do at 6 weeks postpartum, they make my heart hurt because I'm like, women were literally destroying their bodies trying to meet standards. Like
Mm-hmm.
like used to women, service women had to take a PT test at 6 weeks postpartum. I can't even imagine. I'm pretty sure my insides would just fall out if I had to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what? Like, no, no, like that should have never been a thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, like pushing, like if you're trying to get back into getting ready for the PT test, you should always start with focusing on your pelvic floor and your core before progressing to
Mhm.
more of like that strength and that running. And for
Mhm.
anyone who is listening, please, if you are postpartum, or even if it's years postpartum and you notice yourself leaking a little bit, like let's do some pelvic floor therapy
Mhm.
because I promise you it's going to be a game changer.
Yes.
So so we've been talking about WIT, and then can anyone like join this? Like, how do you get involved? And like, what was your journey as far as like the involvement? Because I know you were already doing JAG stuff, so it almost kind of like parallels very well. So like, can anyone join? And like, what is that journey look like?
So not everyone can join. So since we are a official DAF organization, it is limited to current service members in any component, reserve guard or active duty, and then federal civilians for the Department of the Air Force WIT. The other service WITs have their own processes and how they seek people to volunteer for them, but essentially we're all volunteers. So, I do this in my free time. So that's how you kind of join. We do have some spouses who do volunteer with us in some other various groups throughout the department, but a lot of what we deal with there is information that we have to basically like email over a Department of the Air Force, email system that we can't just send to like Gmail accounts and stuff. So then it becomes a logistics hurdle to how do we get this information to somebody who doesn't have a us.af.mil email. That's something we're working through right now. We're trying to get over that hurdle, but the bureaucracy is strong, and despite the fact that we're supposed to be like, super cutting edge when it comes to all these like communication stuff, we can't figure out how to get people email addresses. So hopefully we'll figure that out. How I came to be on the WIT. So you're right. Like it makes sense that as someone who's trained to read the law and the read policy that I would end up where I ended up. But really it was because of my personal circumstances. So a first sergeant friend of mine basically sent me a calendar invite and was like, hey, I think you would like this thing. You should dial into the meetings. So I started dialing into the meetings, and they sought volunteers to do the first strategic offsite. And this is something now we do annually. In fact, this year it's on September 19th at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. The invite will be going out soon. So if anybody that's listening would like information on that, I can share that information. But I helped plan that. And it was just like a small part that I was playing in that. And I got to go and really dip my toes. And what came out of that, it was me being like, well, I already had one child. I was getting ready to have my second, and I did breastfeed both of my children. And I was like, well, they give me a breast pump, they give me a place to pump, they give me a refrigerator at work. But like, how in the world am I supposed to get this milk home when I'm like TDY for like 2 weeks?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, why don't we provide this support to lactating parents? And dug into the regs and found out that there just was not a policy. And we actually needed to change a Department of Defense policy. So I didn't just go, low level for the Air Force only. It had to be everybody. And that kind of started a 2.5-year journey to changing that policy, which we have now. Since then, at 2.5 years on to that, we actually had it expanded to PCSs. It is limited to a lactating service member. So right now it's not an option for dependent spouses, but we still have ongoing efforts to change. Because here's the thing about, the bureaucracy and policy within the department. You're never going to sink the iceberg. It's never going to be, oh, they're going to demolish this horrible policy and, have a perfect new policy that's in its place. Never happens. It's like chipping away at the iceberg. So little, small, incremental wins until hopefully at some point we get a policy that is inclusive, holistic in nature, and really gets at the problem. So, that was in 2019 that I started that, and I still am working updates to the Joint Travel Reg for transport of breast milk, along with, helping shepherd other policy changes through the process. So it was really, I tell people it was luck that I kind of ended up with the WIT. It was also, me just sending an email to Aaliyah Nadeem, who was the co-chair of the WIT at the time. She did not know me from Adam. And I sent her an email with like, hey, I have this crazy idea. Can I do it with the WIT? And she's like, sure, why not? So,
Might as
and she
well.
took me under her wing and kind of showed me the ropes of how to change policy. Fun fact, I have never been stationed at the Pentagon. I have actually never worked in the Pentagon as my full-time job, although I spend a lot of time talking with people in the Pentagon and making trips there for WIT stuff. But yeah, that's how I kind of got involved and ended up where I ended up.
Dang, girl. So you left active duty. You joined the Guard because of your marital situation. You kind of career pivoted out of law to public policy, and especially with like this WIT. Like, what does your day look like?
So it ebbs and it flows. So I still have a full-time job as an attorney with the Department of the Army. So I'm an attorney advisor. I am, for those out there that are listening that are looking at like a career pivot, like you've been doing something for a long time, I'm here to tell you, like, I am there. Like, I know my passion is public policy, and that's where I want to be. I don't mind being an attorney. I can be an attorney, but it's not really what drives me. So if you're there, you're not alone. I'm going through the very same thing right now. Like, how do I get paid to do this stuff full time? Kind of place. But my typical day, like I go do my civilian job. Thankfully that since I have a government computer, I'm kind of able to like monitor all the email accounts that I need to monitor. I have the flexibility in my day job to be able to like step out and handle things with the WIT stuff if I need to, since obviously I'm a guardsman. I'm not always on orders. There's also 3 other co-chairs. So there's another Air Force co-chair and there's 2 Space Force co-chairs. So between the 4 of us, we're able to kind of tackle things like that. But, I think my life is probably just like any other working mom's life, up at the crack of dawn to like hopefully drink my coffee in peace, if none of the kids wake up. Morning time is like my time with them. It's, what my husband and I have kind of worked. Like, I like to be here in the morning, drop off at school, things like that, and then head into work. Whereas he will usually do afternoons if he's here, do afternoons, and then I usually stay a little bit later at work. I try to be very protective of my time in the evenings. Like, most people who work with me know that like from 5:30 to like 8, Sam's in mom mode. So I'm not usually, unless it's something that I've scheduled myself that I want to do, not going to be taking calls or on email or doing anything like that. There are exceptions to that, but I try to also set those boundaries to not get burnt out. I spend a lot of time like on drives, knocking out phone calls, a lot of time knocking out emails in between things. So just trying to I'm a big time, I block my time. So I'll block an hour for something and I focus on that, block another hour. And that's kind of how I structure my day.
So I love that you're like doing that whole life, like work-life balance. Like that is definitely something, especially now that we have phones and have like, everything is in our hands, that there really isn't a time to really shut it off. So that whole work-life balance tends to get very, very blurred. So what advice would you give someone who is struggling, especially like as a service member, on creating that work-life balance?
I think you got to figure out what works for you. What does balance look like? I think balance sometimes is a tricky word to use because it's never going to be balanced. And I'm sure you know this as a mom. Like it's never balanced. It's always like, all the things. So I like to say work-life integration. Like, how does my work life integrate with my personal life and vice versa, so that they're more like harmonious? And even then, sometimes it's not harmonious. We're just making it through the day. So figure out what that is for you and then stick to those boundaries. Like I said, anybody who works with me, whether that be at my profession, like my job or with the WIT, they know from 5:30 to 8, like Sam's in mom mode. So unless literally the Pentagon is on fire and people need Sam, she's probably not going to have access to her phone or doing any of that. I also do try to be very protective over my weekends to the extent that I can. I knock out a lot of stuff during nap times when the kiddos are down for naps or doing quiet time or whatnot. So I think you just have to figure out what that looks like for you. What it looks like for me may not be what it looks like for you. I tend to work out at the end of my workday. I've tried working out in the mornings. I'm not a morning person. It just does not work. So I do it at the end of the day. It's just what I prefer. Now, my husband, he's the exact opposite. I think he'd probably prefer to work out in the mornings. I like having my morning quiet coffee time for like 30 minutes, drink my coffee and read my book. That's how I like to start my day. So I think you just have to know what works for you, and then let others know that too. I have never received any pushback, even from bosses. I've been very lucky to have bosses that have encouraged that, and I've engaged in dialogue with them about, about those things. Because I do, send emails sometimes at random times, I will tell people in the email, like, I may be sending this at 9:30 at night because I just had a thought pop into my head and I will forget this if I don't send it now, but I do not expect you to respond. So I think that's important too, especially post-COVID, where there's a lot of remote work and a lot of telework, as you mentioned. Having constant access to the internet or work via your phone or your computer can be really damaging, which makes it even more important to set those boundaries for yourself, and then also encourage the people that you supervise or you work with to have those boundaries, and then know that they have them and don't try to push, respect them.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact that you added, or you mentioned adding, I don't expect a reply, because I know I'm this way. If someone sends me a message, I think, and especially if they know I read it, and this is why I hate sometimes with Facebook and Instagram, and I shut it off on my iPhone where it says do not, it doesn't say a read
I have
receipt.
that shut off too.
Because I feel guilty if I read it and I didn't respond right away. Mm-hmm. Because I don't know, it's just a guilt thing for me. So if I know I don't have to respond to someone right away, I just feel like that would probably take the anxiety out of it. Mm-hmm. So I think that is actually a good tip to implement. And especially if you're the boss too, mm-hmm. people your subordinates or troops, or they're probably oh man, I really got to get this done.
Yeah. Another good tip that I've found too, that I will do sometimes, is if I am knocking out emails later at night on Outlook, depending on what server you're on, you can actually schedule the email. You can draft it, but then you can schedule it to go out later. So I may write it at 10 p.m., but I can schedule it to go out at 7 or 8 a.m. the next morning. So that way the person isn't getting it at 10:30 at night. They're getting it in the morning, and so maybe they don't, feel compelled to respond as quickly. So that's another tip that I think is awesome for that too. So I can do my work and get it knocked out on my time, but then also not have people feel bad and doing stuff all hours of the night when they really shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's actually, I knew of that, but I feel like it's not a forefront thing. So I always forget you can schedule your emails.
Yeah.
So speaking of books, because you said you like to read in the morning, which I also am not a morning person. So I wake up right before the kids because I'd rather sleep. But you are also becoming a co-author of a children's book. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. So actually my first co-chair on the WIT, Megan Biles, she's a AFSOC pilot, came to be, we've done a lot of policy work, obviously very passionate about offering the opportunity to excel to all service members, providing support and resources to everyone. We were actually coming out of a meeting with the Secretary of the Air Force. Megan had basically championed the policy to change flying while pregnant. So policy before, as soon as you became pregnant, you were DNIF, meaning you did not fly. As soon as you tested positive, could not fly. Present day, due in large part to Megan's efforts, you can now, you test positive, you can apply for a waiver, and you can pretty much, as long as you are a low risk pregnancy, you can fly the entire time you're pregnant, as long as you can get a waiver. So huge change, monumental change for female aviators who want to have children. Because, right, if you're a pilot and you're not flying for 9 months, that's problematic. You can't keep up with your quals, career progression is stalled, all those things. So coming out of a meeting with the Secretary of the Air Force, and we were highlighting a few different policies to him. And we're in the halls of the Pentagon. Megan is very good poet, like prolific poet. She's just good at writing poetry, and I knew that about her. So we just started like engaging. I think she actually said something first, like a rhyme about all the things, and this is the title of the book, all the things our mommy can do. And it was like being a pilot, being a soldier, an engineer, a police officer, all these cultural things where we are no longer viewing pregnancy as a disability and allowing women, should they choose, right? Should they choose, we're not going to mandate them to do it, but should they choose to do these things while they're pregnant? And we just were like spitting rhymes to each other, walking down the Pentagon halls. And I was like, I was the kid when people who would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I was like 7, I would tell them an author. Like my mom has all these like paper books that I would like write as a child. So that's what I wanted to be. And I was like, oh my gosh, we are writing a children's book. And Megan's like, okay, Sam, because I'm one of those that have lots of, I have like a list of things that I want to do in my life. Writing a children's book
girl.
is one. So she's like, yeah, whatever, Sam. And I'm like, no, we're going to do this. I had no idea what we were doing, but we ended up getting our manuscript done, getting it published. And now it is available on Amazon in both paper and hardback. And it highlights all the things that a mom can do while pregnant. And it's told from the perspective of an older sibling who is watching their mother do all these things while pregnant.
I love that. So you have one, or is it like, this is what my mommy could do, soldier edition, this is what mommy could do, police edition, or is it all kind of into one?
It's all one book, but every page is different. So we tried to focus very heavily on diversity so that all children could see themselves in the book. But as you go through the book, it starts out with the sibling, seeing their mama's pregnant stomach, being like, oh, you're pregnant. When's the due date? I'm so excited. Does their tummy feel strange? And then it goes into the pilot, like, I see you soaring through the sky. And then there's a race car driver, and then it's a police officer. And it's all different types of women and children that look differently.
Okay, so I'm going to tag the link in the show notes. So please, everyone, check this out and read it to your kids, because this is amazing. Like, yeah. I love that whole idea, because it also teaches, especially our daughters, that we could be anything that we want to be. And then it teaches our sons that girls could do it too. Yeah. So it's like such a good book. Like, do you guys plan on like writing more books, or like, what's that look like? So I mean, I know you're busy, like, not that you have,
we have to write one for dads. So this is the thing. We've already kind of been working the manuscript for one that is based on, all the things our daddy can do, and focusing on, and I don't like to use the term non-traditional, but what American society sees as non-traditional roles of men, which are being a primary caretaker, highlighting what a man can do to care for mommy, like while she's recovering from pregnancy. So yes, we're working on that version. Might be a little while before we can roll it out, but we are working on it, and we plan to put that out there as well, because we feel like that is just as important as, all the things our mommy can do is all the things our daddy can do.
Yeah, I love that idea too, because my husband has always said, he's like, once I retire, I'll be the primary caretaker and you could just go off and make the money. I was like, okay, babe. Yeah. So I love that, the non-traditional aspects, because there really is, like, society has still those gender roles, which is still slightly annoying, but go ahead and break them.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and that's the whole point, with the two books is to kind of break through that. I don't know if you've ever seen the commercial. If you haven't, it's called The Dream Gap. It was a commercial done a few years ago. I forget who it was by, Mercedes-Benz or someone like that. But it highlights this whole idea of, like, you can be what you can see. And it's like little, like, girls watching things. But what they call it is the dream gap, which is where a child goes from dreaming one thing, and then at some point American culture changes what they believe they can do. So there's a gap between what they can dream and what reality is.
It's actually really depressing when you think about that.
It was. So I did a LinkedIn post the first time I ever saw it, and I can't believe, because it was done in like 14, 15. It's not a new thing. And when I watched it for the first time last year during Women's History Month, actually this year during Women's History, it was so moving. Like, very rarely does something move me. Like, I think I was in tears at the end of it. It was that moving.
Okay. I'm gonna have to watch that now too. It probably inspired me to make sure that I'm stuck on my goals and I can do whatever everyone says I can't do.
Yeah.
And yeah, now that I have kids, I just want to make sure that they know, regardless of their gender, they could do anything.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I love the concept of the book. So yes, for anyone who's listening, I'll put the link in the show notes. So please definitely check it out. So to kind of wrap things up, what are some like pieces of advice you would give someone who's listening right now?
So there's 3 things that I always tell folks when I talk to them. And it kind of all comes back to the WIT work and kind of the public policy work that I do and why I do what I do. So the first is never walk past a problem. You never know who that problem is also impacting. That's not just you. I use Megan, my co-author, as a great example. Megan doesn't have children, but every policy that she has championed has been for parents. So it wasn't something that was personally impacting her, but she chose not to walk past the problem. She took it on anyways. Another big thing that was a big advocate for was changing the federal legislation called the Cadet Act, which allows for cadets at the various service academies to keep their children if they become pregnant. Before this, they were either, I don't want to say forced, but their choices were to have an abortion or give up custody of the child after it was born. It was like that for years, for decades. This legislation was passed a couple years ago where now that's not the case. They don't have to do that in order to stay at the service academy. All to say, that wasn't her lived experience, but she took it on anyway. So never walk past a problem, because you never know how you might inspire or touch someone. The biggest compliment that I can get on any day is when somebody emails me and says, "Thank you for doing this because it made life easier for me." The second thing is, don't ever take no from somebody who doesn't have the authority to tell you yes, especially in the bureaucracy that is the Department of Defense. There's a lot of people who think they can tell you no, and the WIT gets told no, and I get told no a lot on a daily basis. Usually what I hear is not yet, but I also don't take no from somebody that can't give me a yes. Like, who is the actual decision maker? And doing that in a respectful way, because we are still in the military, right? There's a way to respectfully disagree with somebody and say thank you. I will let the decision maker know your opinion. I'm not going to hide it, but I still disagree, and keep moving on. The last piece of advice is to find your why. The reason that is so important is because when you're getting all those no's, or you're getting somebody that tells you can't do something, or if you feel like you're just hitting a roadblock, your why is what's going to keep pushing you forward. My why is my children, because I have 2 boys and a girl. And what I tell people is, I don't ever want my son, if he decides, for example, let's say to be a pilot, to look to his right and see a woman and think it's odd, or to see a woman that's pregnant flying a plane and think it's weird or uncomfortable or what have you. I don't want him to have a second thought in the world, who's sitting next to him, as long as they're a qualified pilot. And for my daughter, I don't want her to have to navigate some of the barriers that I've experienced, or that some of my friends and my colleagues have experienced. Literally, the number one goal of the Women's Initiatives team is that we put ourselves out of business, and that one day there won't need to be a Women's Initiatives team, because it won't be necessary. Because dual military children have like a double 50% chance of serving. A child with one parent usually has a 20% chance of serving. It doubles for dual military children, meaning at least one of my children is probably going to serve. And so they're why I do what I do, to try to make the department a better place, so that they can have all the tools, resources, and support necessary to be successful in whatever they decide to do.
That is always something that I always tell people too, is just stick with your why. Start with why. I will always say it. Simon Sinek, his book, Start With Why, I always recommend it, because you know, a lot of people think it's like a business book, and sometimes it can start off like that. But like, if you pull back the layers and really dig into why you're doing it, when you don't have that motivation, it will keep you going. Because, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, once you hit those roadblocks, it is easy to give up. And like coming from like, again, like that health and fitness perspective, when people aren't losing weight, they're like, well, I'm done. Like, and then they give up. Remember why you started. And I always tell that. So I think that is such great advice. I always tell people that too. Start with your why, keep your why, find your why.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So for anyone who wants to get into contact with you, what is the best way?
So you can find me on LinkedIn, and you can also find me on Facebook. But probably the quickest thing to do is on LinkedIn. So you can find me on either one of those forums.
And that's actually how her and I got connected, was through the WIT Facebook group and through Facebook. So that is another thing that I will tell people too, especially if you want to, you know, make changes and collaborate, is to network. And
Mm-hmm.
networking, because even like you said with your friends and how you created a book and changing all these policies, like networking and collaborating, do it. It doesn't matter what platform you are on, like it can move mountains. So I will add those links into the show notes as well. So please, anyone who is listening, please reach out to Sam. Sam, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day. I know this is the time that you spend with your kids, but it means the world that to hear your perspective on how you're eliminating those barriers and changing, you know, culture one policy at a time.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening. Like I said, I will add all those links into the show notes. Please reach out to her if you have any questions. Until next time, we will talk to you soon.